Okay, good morning everyone. Thank you for having me here today. So my starting points are this. It is perfectly reasonable to believe that sex is binary and immutable, and also to believe that those struggling with their gender identity deserve support, mental and medical treatment, deserve to be treated with respect, and that conversion therapy in the strict sense of the term is abhorrent. These statements are not mutually exclusive, although many on the other side would paint them out to be so. Secondly, it's this: gender dysphoria, this debilitating mismatch between someone's body and their inner identity, is a mental health condition. And in this country, in order to transition legally or medically, you must be diagnosed with it. So this is the frame of reference through which I approach this entire topic. So I thought I would start with some mental health ethics before moving on to the conversion therapy legislation itself, and firstly a few broad principles around psychotherapy and counselling. The first, which is borrowed from the Hippocratic Oath, is this idea of first doing no harm to your patient or client. Secondly, one of the core tenets of psychotherapy is that you should never enter into the therapy room with a predetermined outcome. It should all be about open, empathetic exploration. And thirdly, this idea of congruence. This is the idea of the therapists themselves being real, being genuine, and being fully integrated in terms of the therapy that they are offering. So let's come back to gender dysphoria again, which, as I said, is a mental health condition. And this is increasingly being treated through this idea of affirmation, affirming that somebody is trans, affirming that somebody should medically transition. And I would argue that this is fundamentally incompatible with exploration, because if a therapist says, I'm going to affirm you no matter what, they are going into the therapy room with a predetermined outcome. And to my knowledge, gender dysphoria is the only mental health condition which is treated by affirming the distressing thoughts inside somebody's head, or even trying to physically modify someone's body. For example, if we take anorexia or body dysmorphia, the proposed treatment for these conditions are not liposuction. Why should it be any different for gender dysphoria? So now I move on to the medicalization of children and the slippery slope that we've seen here, and the contrast between this and ethical explorative therapy. And the first and most important statistic I want to share with you all is about the rate of desistance, because studies have shown that upwards of 80% of children who feel that they are trapped in the wrong bodies will, with time, with therapy, settle into themselves and become comfortable with who they are. So let's contrast this with the pathways that we're currently putting children on. Puberty blockers. Well, we're often told that these are reversible, but in fact they are anything but. A young person's natural development has been disrupted. Studies have shown the impact on brain development and bone growth. There are untold social effects. And it very literally is a slippery slope, because studies have shown that upwards of 90% of children who commence on puberty blockers will go on to take cross-sex hormones. And these hormones can have significant irreversible effects. For example, if a young person starts puberty blockers before they have actually commenced puberty and then goes straight on to take cross-sex hormones, that young person can be left permanently infertile. We live in a very strange society in which a child in this country may not be able to buy a scratch card or vote in an election, but can consent to experimental, irreversible treatment. And then, of course, we've got surgery, most particularly double mastectomies. And we see euphemistic language being used here. I've seen them referred to as gender confirmation procedures. Pink News and Snapchat have recently launched a joint initiative entitled Pure Trans Joy, which is basically the glorification of double mastectomies. They tell their young listeners that you could feel a sense of, quote, euphoria if you have your breasts removed. So we see a complete sidestepping of risk here, and also an increased commercialisation, because there are a lot of private clinics out there set to make a lot of money out of performing these type of procedures. It's no surprise, therefore, that we are seeing a worryingly increasing number of detransitioners emerging almost every single day, who have suffered irreversible harm, both mentally and physically, from transitioning. for decisions that adults, I would argue, should never have let them make in the first place. Because in truth, we've robbed children of the opportunity to explore, to develop, to experiment, to grow without irreversible regret. Particularly so when we consider the various comorbidities that exist in this space in relation to gender dysphoria. Often those presenting with gender dysphoria have struggled with, for example, historic trauma or bullying, autism spectrum disorder, even internalised homophobia. All of these require proper exploration. I'm constantly hearing from the other side that we should not pathologise being trans, and yet I'm also told that we must make irreversible medication and surgery available to treat it. I would say that you simply cannot have it both ways. So moving on to conversion therapy legislation and the potential ramifications, and why I argue that good criminal legislation in this space is not possible. There are a number of criteria that you must think of when considering introducing new legislation. So I just want to talk you through these. Firstly, identifying a clear harm. Now, as we know, this has been termed by the government as conversion therapy, but this term is a misnomer. In fact, the government themselves have acknowledged that it is misleading because the vast majority of these practices take place in family homes or religious settings. So we have not even from the title of the prospective legislation identified what the harm is. The second question we need to ask ourselves is this legislation necessary? And I would argue that it isn't, because the vast majority of conversion therapy practices, thankfully, have already been caught by existing legislation. When people think of conversion therapy, they think of electric shock treatment, violence, coercive rape. These are all caught by existing legislation. And yet I hear organisations such as Stonewall saying lines such as, if the government do not ban conversion therapy, they are permitting the torture of trans children. Well, the last time I checked, torture was already illegal in this country. And so is this nothing more than virtue signalling on behalf of the government? Thirdly, legislation must ensure that it only captures the harm intended. And again, we run into some difficulties with the government's own definitions. For example, they've centred the proposal around this idea of suppression of gender identity. They say, well, if somebody, they say that if somebody is trying to suppress or hold back somebody from expressing who they really are, that this could be conversion therapy. But I would argue that this term suppression is vague and ambiguous. For example, could it be suppression for a therapist to pause for thought and reflection in a therapy session? Could it be suppression for a therapist to consider various options that their client has other than medically transitioning? Could it be suppression for a therapist to consider contributing factors that have led to their client feeling this way? Could it be suppression for a therapist to even challenge their client in terms of what they're saying? All of these things are ethical, normal, therapeutic techniques. Could these be caught by this legislation and therefore outlawed? Secondly, the government are focused on this idea of questioning gender identity. They suggest, well, if somebody is questioning who they are, it's okay to challenge them, but if they're certain that they're trans, you shouldn't be going there. Well, as I'm sure all of us here today can appreciate, children can be very certain of many things throughout their life, particularly their adolescent years, and especially if they've spent hours online being affirmed or engaging in self-diagnosis. The historic test for whether a child would benefit from medical transition was whether they were, quote, consistent, insistent, and persistent. I have many colleagues and friends who suffered from gender dysphoria as children, and they tell me very clearly that they would have met that criteria, and they say to me, thank God I'm not a child in today's society because I would have transitioned and I would have regretted it. So the truth is we are not good at predicting for whom medical transitioning is the appropriate pathway. Fifthly, good legislation requires good evidence. Now, the most frequently cited source in the government's proposals is the Government Equalities Office 2018 LGBT survey. And this is a non-random, online, self-report survey which, by the government's own admission, cannot be generalised to the wider LGBT population. Equally, we are still awaiting evidence around best practice in children's gender clinics. Dr. Hilary Cass is currently undertaking a review for the government. We are waiting for her final report to come in. We should not be rushing through controversial and complex legislation without the full evidence and the full facts. Finally, good legislation must avoid unintended consequences, of which I would argue there are many in this sphere. For example, if this legislation goes through as Stonewall and other organisations want it to be, we are conflating sexuality with gender identity and gender dysphoria, which is, as I've said, a mental health condition. Secondly, this could have a chilling effect on the therapeutic profession. I've spoken to therapists abroad in countries where similar legislation has been passed, and they tell me they will now refuse to work with children with gender dysphoria for fear of being criminalised and being accused of being a conversion therapist. And finally, and possibly most worryingly, this legislation could itself act as a form of gay conversion therapy, because the majority of individuals with gender dysphoria come out as gay. And I keep hearing anecdotally and through my networks that in certain communities, cultures and families, they would rather their child was trapped in the wrong body and straight rather than being gay. So could this legislation have a complete reverse impact on what it is intending to do? So I would argue that legislation is not appropriate here. Now, thankfully, in the Queen's speech, they made it clear that they were only going to include sexuality as part of this legislation and not gender identity. But I've been told that when this reaches the House of Commons, there are many MPs who are going to try and force gender identity back into this legislation through amendments. Finally, just a few words on free speech. You know, it's a real sign of the times when our Prime Minister comes out and says that there is a biological difference between men and women, and this is heralded as some sort of big day in our society. And then we saw in the immediate aftermath Pink News and other similar news outlets accusing the Prime Minister of engaging in dog whistling and backing bigots. I think that's a real sign of the time that we are all living in today. From a therapeutic perspective, there is a complete shutting down of free speech. There's a group of therapists called the Coalition Against Conversion Therapy. Its chairperson, a non-binary individual called Dr. Iggy Moon, recently said in an interview, quote, "If you are a therapist and you believe in a two-sex model, you should not be seeing clients." I cannot think of a more overtly discriminatory comment to make against therapists, basically saying if you believe there are two sexes, if you believe there's a difference between men and women, you shouldn't be a therapist at all. And so this brings me on to my own case, because I felt that I had to do something about all of this. And up until the middle of last year, I was undertaking a master's degree in psychotherapy. I was in my third year. I was on the cusp of setting up a private practice. And I started a public petition to the government. And I asked the government, if you ban conversion therapy, please safeguard explorative therapy for children with gender dysphoria. And the petition got 10,000 signatures, and we received a very favourable response from the government. And I engaged in various media publicity on this topic at the time. I began to attract attacks online and abuse through social media from proponents of gender ideology and trans activists. And then one day in May, out of nowhere, an email dropped into my inbox entitled Termination of Contract. And in that 2-paragraph email, I was told that I was being expelled from my master's degree because I had brought my profession into disrepute. I was provided with no evidence, no hearing, no appeal. In fact, I didn't have a single conversation with anyone at the university before they expelled me. And that same evening, my university took to Twitter to publicise my expulsion and put out a statement of solidarity with the LGBT community, in a sense pitting them against me. So in one email, my entire future vocation had gone up in smoke. And as a result of this, I'm now taking my university institution and my therapeutic regulatory body to the Employment Tribunal for discrimination against my beliefs on sex and gender. As a former lawyer myself, I believe that litigation should be a last resort, but for many of us these days, unfortunately, it truly is the only resort. Litigation is extremely expensive. I've had to crowdfund the fees to be able to bring this case, and were it not for the generosity of thousands of complete strangers, I would be unable to bring this case at all. But it demonstrates the strength of feeling that is out there, because I've been contacted by concerned social workers, doctors, teachers, lawyers, therapists, all of whom tell me that they are too afraid to speak out for fear of the same thing happening to them. The purpose of bringing this case is, of course, to restore my own reputation and to get compensation, but more importantly, it's to send a message to educational institutions and to make sure that this doesn't happen to another student again. We truly live in terrifying times in which therapists and trainee therapists who have concerns about the treatment for a complex mental health condition can effectively be cancelled simply for asking for a conversation in the first place. Conversion therapy legislation risks criminalising ethical therapists and forcing an affirmation-only model on young, vulnerable children. More and more, this truly feels as if it is the issue of our time. Thank you.